"You don't belong in this lounge. People like you wait outside." The words landed with the confidence of someone who had never imagined being questioned. They echoed across the polished marble floor of the executive VIP lounge on the 42nd floor of the Lexington Tower in downtown Chicago, drawing every conversation to an abrupt stop. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting lips. Laptop screens suddenly lost their importance. Every pair of eyes turned toward the woman standing quietly near the entrance. Naomi Brooks didn't react. She wore dark blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and a charcoal sweater beneath a lightweight black jacket. No designer logos. No expensive jewelry. No entourage announcing her arrival. She carried only a slim leather portfolio and the calm expression of someone who had learned years ago that the loudest people often understood the least. Standing in front of her was Victoria Collins, the lounge manager, a woman in her late 40s with immaculate blonde hair and a perfectly pressed navy blazer. Her smile had vanished the moment Naomi presented her digital lounge pass. Victoria folded her arms and looked Naomi up and down one more time, as though repeating the inspection might somehow change the result. "Ma'am," she said louder this time, making sure the surrounding guests could hear every syllable. "Our VIP facilities are reserved for executives, board members, and premium tenants. You'll need to leave before security escorts you out." A few guests exchanged uncertain glances. Others avoided eye contact entirely. One elderly couple quietly returned to reading the morning financial news, as if pretending nothing unusual was happening. Near the panoramic windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, a young businessman in a tailored gray suit smirked before whispering something that made his companion chuckle. Naomi remained exactly where she stood. Her breathing never changed. She slowly looked around the room, taking in every face, every reaction, every uncomfortable silence. It almost felt as though she were memorizing the moment instead of escaping it. Victoria mistook that silence for hesitation. "Did you hear me?" she asked sharply. "This area isn't open to the general public." Naomi finally lifted her eyes. "I heard every word," she answered softly. Her voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It carried the kind of quiet confidence that somehow made the room feel even smaller. Victoria reached toward the reception desk and pressed a small button beneath the counter. A discreet notification appeared on the security monitor. "We've had people try this before," she continued. "Fake passes, borrowed credentials. They usually leave once they realize the rules apply to everyone." Naomi gave the slightest nod, almost as if acknowledging a familiar script. She had heard different versions of those same assumptions in airports, hotels, boardrooms, and private clubs throughout her career. Different cities, different faces, the same judgment arriving before a single conversation ever began. Across the lounge, a young receptionist named Emily Carter glanced nervously at the reservation screen in front of her. Something on the display caught her attention. Her eyes widened for only a second before she looked back toward Naomi, then toward Victoria, uncertainty replacing confidence. Before Emily could say a word, Victoria shot her a warning glance that froze her in place. The room grew quieter with every passing second. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago carried on as though nothing extraordinary was unfolding. Inside the lounge, however, something invisible had already begun to shift, and the only person who seemed completely aware of it was the woman everyone believed didn't belong. Naomi Brooks slowly lowered her portfolio onto one of the leather chairs near the entrance without asking for permission. She neither sat down nor stepped farther into the lounge. Instead, she quietly observed the room as though every conversation, every expression, and every subtle gesture mattered more than the confrontation itself. Victoria Collins interpreted that composure as stubbornness. "You are making this much harder than it needs to be," she said with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "If you leave now, we can avoid embarrassing everyone." Naomi looked toward the skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. The morning sun reflected across Lake Michigan, casting long beams of light through the lounge. "Interesting," she said calmly. "You seem more concerned about appearances than accuracy." Victoria sighed impatiently. "This is not personal. It is policy." Naomi nodded almost thoughtfully. "Policies are only as good as the people enforcing them." The sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman closing her laptop looked toward Naomi with quiet curiosity before pretending to return to work. The businessman who had laughed earlier folded his newspaper and leaned back, suddenly more interested in the exchange than the market reports in front of him. Behind the reception counter, Emily Carter could not stop staring at the reservation system. She refreshed the page once. Then again, the same information appeared each time. Executive owner access. Unlimited authorization. Permanent building credentials. Emily frowned. She had worked at Lexington Tower for only 6 months, but she knew enough to recognize permissions that ordinary tenants never received. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard before she carefully stood and approached Victoria. "Excuse me," Emily whispered. "I think there might be something you should verify." Victoria barely turned her head. "Not now." Emily hesitated. "The system is showing." Victoria interrupted without even looking at the screen. "I said not now." Emily stopped speaking. The warning in Victoria's voice was unmistakable. Across the lounge, Naomi noticed the exchange without appearing to notice it at all. Her attention drifted toward the elegant furnishings, the original artwork hanging along the walnut-paneled walls, and the polished brass fixtures that reflected the morning light. There was a familiarity in the way she studied every detail, almost as though she remembered choosing them herself years ago. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound polite while ensuring everyone nearby could still hear. "You are welcome to wait in the public lobby downstairs while someone confirms your identity." Naomi answered with the same measured calm. "My identity has never been the problem." Victoria frowned. "Then what is?" Naomi met her eyes. "The assumptions people make before they know it." The room fell silent again. No one laughed this time. Emily glanced once more at the monitor before quietly opening another internal directory. The name Naomi Brooks appeared again, attached to documents that required executive clearance. Emily's heartbeat quickened. She looked from the screen to the woman standing near the entrance and back again. Something was deeply wrong. Not with the reservation. Not with the credentials. With everything happening around them. Yet before she could gather the courage to speak again, Victoria reached across the counter, turned the monitor slightly away from Emily's view, and calmly said, "Close that page. We already know everything we need to know." Emily obeyed, but the uncertainty remained on her face, while Naomi continued standing exactly where she was, patient enough to let every decision in the room reveal far more than any introduction ever could. Victoria Collins folded her hands neatly across the reception counter, her confidence growing stronger with every silent second. "Since you are refusing to leave," she said, "I am going to ask building security to assist you." She reached for the desk phone instead of waiting for an answer. Naomi Brooks simply watched her with the same composed expression. "That is your decision," she replied. Victoria pressed a button. "Security to the executive VIP lounge, please. We have an unauthorized individual refusing to comply with lounge policy." Her words traveled farther than she intended. Guests throughout the room looked up from their coffee and laptops. Conversations dissolved into whispers. A tall man wearing an expensive navy suit slowly stood from one of the corner tables. His silver watch caught the morning sunlight as he walked closer with an amused smile. "This is becoming quite a scene," he said. Looking directly at Naomi, he added, "There is no shame in admitting you walked into the wrong place." Naomi met his gaze without irritation. "Is that what you believe happened?" The man shrugged. "People make mistakes. Pride usually makes them worse." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Exactly." Before Naomi could answer, another guest quietly laughed. "Some people think confidence can replace credentials." A few polite chuckles followed, but not everyone joined. Several faces around the lounge reflected growing discomfort instead of amusement. Emily Carter remained frozen behind the reception desk. She opened the reservation system once again, this time searching internal ownership records instead of guest access. The result appeared almost instantly. Naomi Brooks. Primary ownership authorization. Executive administrative clearance. Emily stared at the screen, convinced she had made a mistake. She checked again. The information remained exactly the same. Her breathing became noticeably quicker. She stepped toward Victoria once more. "Miss Collins," she whispered urgently, "please look at this." Victoria did not even turn around. "Emily, enough." "But I really think." "I said enough." Emily lowered her voice further. "I believe we are making a serious mistake." Victoria finally faced her, her expression firm and unmistakably impatient. The mistake would be allowing someone without proper authorization to remain here simply because they refuse to cooperate. Emily glanced back at the screen. She has authorization. Victoria leaned closer until only Emily could hear her. You are new here. Learn the difference between what the computer says and what common sense tells you. Emily looked down in disbelief. Across the lounge, Naomi had noticed every word, even though neither woman had spoken loudly. She slowly picked up her portfolio and rested it against the chair beside her, remaining exactly where she stood. Moments later, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Two building security officers stepped into the lounge wearing dark gray uniforms with Lexington Tower badges on their jackets. They approached calmly, neither appearing rushed nor confrontational. The senior officer offered a professional nod. Good morning, he said. We received a request for assistance. Victoria pointed directly toward Naomi. This woman does not belong in the executive VIP lounge. Please escort her to the public lobby. The officer turned toward Naomi before speaking. Ma'am, may I see your access credentials? Naomi smiled politely. Of course. But before you decide where I belong, I would encourage everyone in this room to be absolutely certain they know whose building they are standing in. An uneasy silence settled over the lounge. Even the businessman who had mocked her only moments earlier stopped smiling, while Emily quietly looked from Naomi to the security officers, hoping someone would finally ask the one question no one else had bothered to ask. The senior security officer accepted the digital credential Naomi Brooks held out without hesitation. He studied the screen for several seconds, then frowned almost imperceptibly. The credential itself appeared authentic, but before he could examine it further, Victoria Collins stepped between them with practiced certainty. That pass has already been questioned, she said. Please proceed with the removal process while we verify everything through management. The officer looked from Victoria to Naomi and then back again. Ma'am, verification usually comes before any decision. Victoria forced a polite smile. I'm the manager of this lounge. I am giving you that verification. Naomi remained perfectly still. Interesting, she said quietly. Verification without investigation. The officer lowered the device slightly, but did not return it yet. Around the lounge, the atmosphere had changed. No one was pretending to work anymore. Coffee had gone untouched. Laptop screens had dimmed from inactivity. Every guest sensed that something no longer fit the story they had accepted only minutes earlier. Behind the reception desk, Emily Carter could not remain silent any longer. She took a careful step forward, her hands trembling just enough for Victoria to notice. I need to say something. Victoria answered without turning around. Emily, go back to your station. Emily swallowed hard. I cannot. Every eye shifted toward the young receptionist. Her name is in the executive ownership directory, Emily said, her voice growing steadier with every word. Not the guest list. The ownership directory. Victoria laughed once, short and dismissive. You are reading the wrong file. Emily shook her head. I checked it 3 times. Victoria folded her arms. Then you checked the wrong system 3 times. Emily looked toward the security officers. Please, before anyone asks her to leave, open the building authorization records yourselves. The senior officer glanced toward his partner but remained silent. Victoria immediately stepped closer to Emily. You are creating unnecessary confusion in front of our guests. No, Emily replied softly. I think we already created that ourselves. A murmur spread through the lounge. The businessman who had mocked Naomi earlier slowly lowered his coffee cup. An older woman seated near the windows removed her reading glasses and studied Naomi with renewed curiosity. Another guest quietly whispered, If she is telling the truth, this changes everything. Victoria heard the comment and quickly raised her voice. Nothing has changed. We have procedures for a reason. Naomi finally spoke again. Procedures should protect fairness, not assumptions. The words settled heavily over the room. Emily returned to the reception terminal and, despite Victoria's obvious frustration, reopened the executive authorization database. She turned the monitor just enough for the senior security officer to see it from several feet away. His eyes narrowed. A single line near the top of the screen immediately caught his attention. Executive ownership access. Permanent administrative authority. He took one slow step toward the desk. Victoria moved just as quickly. placing herself between him and the monitor. "That information is restricted," she said firmly. "I will contact corporate myself." Emily stared at her manager in disbelief. "Why would we call corporate before confirming what is already in our own system?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Victoria did not answer immediately. Her silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for doubt to spread across every face in the lounge. Naomi noticed it all without the slightest trace of satisfaction. She simply stood with the quiet patience of someone who understood that the truth rarely needed to raise its voice because eventually it asked questions that confidence alone could never answer. The senior security officer slowly handed Naomi Brooks her credential back without saying a word. He was no longer looking at her with suspicion. He was looking at the situation itself. His years of experience had taught him that confidence often sounded loud, but truth usually remained remarkably calm. Victoria Collins noticed the subtle change immediately and stepped forward once again, determined to regain control before uncertainty spread any further. "This discussion has already taken enough of everyone's time," she declared. "Escort her downstairs while I contact corporate management." Neither security officer moved. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer inside the silent lounge. Naomi gently picked up her leather portfolio and rested both hands on it. "You should absolutely contact corporate," she said. "I encourage it." Victoria interpreted the response as surrender. A satisfied smile returned to her face. "Finally, that is the first reasonable thing you have said all morning." Naomi simply nodded. "I agree. The truth usually begins with the right phone call." Emily Carter looked from Naomi to the security officers with growing concern. Every instinct told her that allowing this misunderstanding to continue would become a mistake no apology could fully erase. She quietly opened another internal record, searching beyond ownership credentials. A collection of archived renovation approvals appeared on the screen. Each document carried the same digital authorization at the bottom. Naomi Brooks, Executive Owner Approval. Emily clicked another file. The same signature appeared. Then another. The same name again. She felt her heartbeat quicken. This was no database error. This was years of executive decisions permanently attached to the building itself. Emily slowly raised her eyes toward Naomi. The woman standing quietly near the entrance was not nervous. She was not offended. If anything, she seemed almost saddened by how predictable the entire morning had become. Naomi briefly looked across the lounge at the guests who had remained silent since the confrontation began. Their expressions had changed. Some now appeared embarrassed. Others seemed uncomfortable remembering the assumptions they had accepted without question. The businessman who had spoken so confidently earlier avoided looking directly at Naomi altogether. For a brief moment, Naomi remembered another building many years before. She had been much younger then, carrying a folder filled with business proposals she hoped investors would read. Before anyone had opened the folder, someone had mistaken her for a delivery driver and directed her toward a service entrance around the back of the building. No one had apologized after discovering the mistake. They had simply acted as though nothing important had happened. That memory disappeared as quickly as it had surfaced. Naomi returned her attention to the present with the same quiet composure she had carried throughout the morning. "People often believe respect begins after titles are revealed," she said softly. "The truth is that respect matters most before anyone knows who is standing in front of them." No one answered. The words settled deeply into the room. Even Victoria remained silent for a moment before pulling out her company phone. "Fine," she said with renewed determination. "Corporate will settle this once and for all." Naomi gave a polite smile that surprised everyone watching. "Yes," she replied. "I believe they will." As Victoria searched for the executive contact number, several phones throughout the lounge suddenly vibrated almost at the same time with incoming company notifications. Emily glanced toward her monitor as a new priority alert quietly appeared across the top of the screen, and although she had not opened it yet, something about the bright red executive banner told her that the entire direction of the morning was about to change. The notification banner spread through the building's internal network with remarkable speed. Emily Carter opened the alert first, her eyes widening before she instinctively covered her mouth. The message was short, unmistakable, and marked with the highest executive priority. All department heads were instructed to report immediately to the executive VIP lounge. Corporate legal, building operations, Human Resources. Executive Administration. No explanation accompanied the order. Only one line appeared beneath the list. Immediate response required. Emily looked toward Naomi Brooks, then back at the screen, suddenly understanding that whatever had just been activated had reached far beyond the reception desk. Victoria Collins noticed the expression on Emily's face and stepped closer. "What is it now?" she asked impatiently. Emily hesitated before quietly turning the monitor toward her manager. Victoria read the alert once. Then again, her confident expression remained in place, but the certainty behind it had begun to fade. "This does not concern us," she said, although the conviction in her voice sounded noticeably weaker than before. Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing since the confrontation began. She calmly adjusted the sleeve of her jacket and looked across the lounge as if she had been expecting every minute of the morning to unfold this way. The senior security officer checked his own company phone. The identical executive notification appeared there as well. His partner received the same alert only seconds later. They exchanged a brief glance, but neither spoke. Years of professional experience told them that executive priority notices were never issued casually. Around the lounge, several guests who worked inside Lexington Tower quietly checked their own devices. Conversations stopped completely. The businessman who had confidently questioned Naomi earlier slowly lowered his phone after reading the internal notification forwarded by one of his colleagues. His expression shifted from curiosity to genuine concern. Even those who had not received the alert sensed that something significant had changed. Victoria took a slow breath before dialing a corporate executive number from memory. The call connected almost immediately. "This is Victoria Collins from the Executive VIP Lounge," she began. "We have an unauthorized guest creating a disruption, and I need—" She stopped speaking. No one else could hear the voice on the other end, but everyone could watch the color gradually disappear from her face. "Yes," she answered quietly. "She is still here." Another pause. "I understand." A longer silence followed. No, nothing has happened beyond the initial report." Victoria slowly lowered the phone without ending the call herself. The executive on the other end had already disconnected. Emily searched her manager's face for some explanation, but none came. Naomi finally broke the silence with the same calm voice that had never once risen above an ordinary conversation. "Sometimes organizations reveal their values through policies," she said. "Other times, they reveal them through the choices people make before anyone important arrives." The words settled over the room with unusual weight. The senior security officer straightened his posture and quietly stepped to one side, no longer blocking Naomi's path in any direction. It was a subtle gesture, but everyone noticed it. Outside the lounge, the sound of multiple elevator cars arriving one after another echoed through the executive hallway. The doors had not opened yet, but polished footsteps could already be heard approaching in measured rhythm. Every person inside the lounge instinctively turned toward the entrance. Emily felt her heart racing. Victoria stood frozen beside the reception desk, still holding her phone. Naomi simply watched the hallway with quiet patience, as though she had never doubted who would walk through those doors or whose name they would speak first. The executive elevator doors opened with a soft chime that instantly drew every eye in the lounge. People stepped out in measured silence. The chief operating officer walked first, followed by the director of human resources, the general counsel, and the head of building operations. None of them appeared confused. None of them looked around the room, searching for answers. They walked with purpose, crossing the polished marble floor until they stopped directly in front of Naomi Brooks. Without hesitation, the chief operating officer offered a respectful smile. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks. We apologize for the delay." The words settled over the room like complete silence. Victoria Collins stared in disbelief. The businessman near the windows slowly stood from his chair. Emily Carter lowered her eyes for a brief moment, realizing that every concern she had voiced had been justified. Naomi returned the greeting with a calm nod. "Good morning, Daniel. Thank you for coming." Daniel Matthews glanced around the lounge before speaking again. "We received the executive priority alert immediately. Are you all right?" Naomi answered with the same composure she had maintained since arriving. "I am fine. I simply wanted to observe how our guests and employees were treated before anyone recognized my name." The sentence changed everything. Several guests quietly exchanged stunned looks. One woman covered her mouth. Another slowly closed her laptop without taking her eyes off Naomi. Victoria struggled to speak. You know the executive team? Daniel turned toward her with visible confusion. Know her, he repeated. Ms. Brooks is the principal owner of Lexington Tower. She approved the acquisition that saved this property nearly 8 years ago. Every major renovation in this building has carried her authorization. No one said a word. Even the quiet background music suddenly seemed louder than the room itself. Victoria looked toward Emily, then toward the security officers, then back at Naomi, searching desperately for some explanation that no longer existed. Naomi finally met Victoria's eyes. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only disappointment. Earlier this morning, Naomi said gently, "You told me that people like me belonged somewhere else." Victoria lowered her head. Naomi continued, "The difficult part is not that you failed to recognize the owner. The difficult part is that you decided where someone belonged before asking a single meaningful question." Daniel quietly received a tablet from the head of building operations and handed it to Naomi. She glanced at the screen before returning it without comment. Emily noticed that the display contained live security footage from multiple cameras throughout the lounge, documenting every moment since Naomi had arrived. Daniel addressed the room with calm professionalism. For everyone's awareness, this visit was not scheduled publicly. Ms. Brooks regularly conducts unannounced service evaluations because leadership begins with understanding the everyday experience of every guest. A heavy silence followed his words. The businessman who had mocked Naomi stepped forward with obvious embarrassment. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Naomi acknowledged him with a courteous nod. "The apology is appreciated," she replied. "I hope the lesson lasts longer than the embarrassment." She then looked across the entire lounge, her voice remaining calm enough that everyone leaned in to hear every word. Titles may open doors, but character determines how we treat people before those titles are ever revealed. Today was never a test of who owned this building. It became a test of who believed every person deserved dignity from the very beginning. No one moved for several long seconds. The silence inside the executive VIP lounge carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Victoria Collins stood behind the reception desk, her shoulders no longer squared with confidence, but weighed down by the realization that every assumption she had defended had now become part of an official record. Daniel Matthews turned to the Director of Human Resources, who quietly opened a tablet containing the building incident log. "Please begin documenting everything from the moment Ms. Brooks entered the lounge," he said calmly. The Human Resources Director nodded without hesitation. "Security footage, employee statements, and system activity have already been preserved." Victoria finally found her voice. "I never intended for any of this to happen." Naomi Brooks looked at her with the same composed expression she had carried since the first moment she walked through the entrance. "Intent matters," she answered gently. "But impact matters too. Every guest in this room witnessed decisions being made before facts were gathered." Victoria lowered her eyes. There was no argument left to make. Emily Carter remained quietly beside the reception desk until Daniel looked toward her. "Miss Carter," he said, "thank you for speaking up when something did not seem right." Emily seemed almost uncomfortable receiving the attention. "I only followed what the system showed me," she replied. Naomi smiled warmly. "No," she said, "you followed your integrity. Computers provide information. Character determines whether someone has the courage to act on it." Emily felt her eyes begin to water, but she quickly composed herself. Across the lounge, several guests nodded in quiet agreement. The businessman who had laughed earlier stepped forward once again. "I judged you before I knew anything about you," he admitted. "I cannot change that now, but I can learn from it." Naomi accepted his words with a small nod. Growth begins the moment we stop defending our first impression and start questioning it. Daniel then addressed everyone gathered in the lounge. "Effective immediately, the incident will be reviewed under our workplace respect and guest experience standards. Additional training will be scheduled for all customer-facing teams throughout Lexington Tower. Every employee deserves clear expectations, and every guest deserves to be treated with dignity from the moment they arrive." No applause followed. The announcement was too important for celebration. Instead, The room filled with thoughtful silence as people reflected on everything they had witnessed. One guest quietly closed his notebook after writing a final sentence across the page. Another reached for her phone, deleting the message she had been preparing to send about the confrontation because the story she had first believed was no longer the truth. Naomi slowly picked up her leather portfolio. She did not look victorious. She looked reflective. "Buildings are easy to renovate," she said as her eyes traveled across the elegant room. "Replacing furniture, updating finishes, improving technology, those things take time and money. Changing the culture inside a building requires something far more valuable. It requires people who are willing to examine their own assumptions before those assumptions become someone else's experience." Daniel nodded respectfully. "We will begin today." Naomi glanced once more toward Emily, who returned a quiet smile. Then she looked at Victoria, whose expression reflected genuine regret rather than fear. Naomi offered one final nod, not as forgiveness already earned, but as recognition that every meaningful change begins with an honest moment of accountability. The atmosphere inside the lounge had completely transformed. Earlier that morning, people had judged a stranger by appearance alone. Now every person standing there understood that the greatest measure of professionalism was never found in a title, a tailored suit, or a private lounge, but in the respect freely given before anyone knew who was truly standing before them. Naomi Brooks walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, as the room remained completely silent behind her. Morning light reflected across the glass towers surrounding Lexington Tower, reminding everyone that the city outside had continued moving while something far more important had changed inside these walls. She rested one hand lightly against the back of a nearby chair before turning to face the employees, executives, security officers, and guests gathered in the lounge. "When I purchased this building," she began quietly, "people congratulated me for acquiring valuable real estate. They believed the investment was about steel, concrete, and glass. They were wrong. Buildings do not create reputations. The people inside them do." Every person listened without interruption. Daniel Matthews stood respectfully to one side, while the Human Resources Director continued documenting the final moments of the incident. Emily Carter remained near the reception desk, her attention fixed entirely on Naomi. Victoria Collins looked up for the first time since the truth had been revealed, listening carefully to every word. Naomi continued, "Every person who walks through these doors arrives carrying a story that nobody else can see. Some have spent years earning opportunities that others assumed they never deserved. Some have faced closed doors without ever understanding why. Others have never experienced being judged before speaking a single word. Leadership means remembering that we never know which story is standing in front of us." She paused briefly, allowing the message to settle throughout the room. Today was never about proving who owned this building. Ownership can be confirmed with paperwork. Character is revealed through ordinary moments when nobody believes they are being evaluated. Daniel nodded quietly, recognizing the deeper purpose behind the unannounced visit. Naomi smiled gently toward Emily. "Miss Carter, thank you for choosing integrity over comfort. Never lose that instinct. Organizations become stronger because of people willing to ask one more question when something does not feel right." Emily smiled with quiet gratitude, understanding that her career would always be shaped by the choice she had made that morning. Naomi then turned toward Victoria. There was no anger in her expression, only sincerity. "Everyone makes mistakes. What defines us afterward is whether we defend them or learn from them. I hope this becomes the day you remember not because it was painful, but because it changed the way you see every person who enters your life." Victoria slowly nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It already has." Naomi acknowledged her with a respectful smile before looking across the lounge one final time. "Treat every stranger with the same dignity you would offer the owner of the building, because one day they may be. More importantly, they should never have to be in order to deserve your respect." No applause followed. None was needed. The silence carried something far more meaningful than celebration. It carried reflection. Naomi picked up her leather portfolio and walked toward the private executive elevator. As the doors opened, Daniel and the executive team stepped aside without a word. She entered the elevator, turned once more toward the lounge, and offered a final calm smile before the doors closed. Long after she disappeared from view, no one immediately returned to their coffee, their meetings, or their conversations. The elegant lounge looked exactly as it had at the beginning of the morning, yet everyone inside understood that it had become a different place. Some lessons are delivered through policies. Others arrive through unexpected encounters that quietly expose the difference between appearance and worth. And the people who remember that difference become the ones who help build a world where dignity is offered first, questions come second, and respect is never reserved only for those whose titles are already known.